Chapter 18. Pat Stevens' smooth insistence on leveling the full drive of the law against Chad Hanlon, clearly guilty of murder though Epstack was not without deep-laden design. Hanlon was the prime mover in all that had gone wrong, and for once the sheriff himself was in full agreement that, of all the loose ends left dangling here, Chad's immediate apprehension was unquestionably paramount. If Dane Hardwick was not overly brilliant as a detective, he knew how to lay a man-trap and ensure its effectiveness. Under his direction, the men rode east at a driving pace. An hour's steady travel saw them beyond the base of the Pinlow Range, with the Sam Simpson bottom stretching away before them. They strung out and shoved their horses into a space-eating run. By mid-afternoon, the net extended for miles over the desert, hemming the bleak pinyon slopes. "You reckon he's up there?" Hardwick asked Pat when the two met in the stunted gray brush. Pat's face was expressionless. "Well, I'll be soon finding out." Scarcely were the words uttered before a shot cracked flatly a quarter-mile away, and whirling they saw Ole Whitten waving and pointing upwards. Pat scanned the rugged slopes, presently spied a solitary horseman hastily working back into the rocky cover a mile above. "That's Hanlon," he whipped out. "He saw us. We'll have to fog him till he gives up now." The posse poured into the hills, laboriously threading the rising shoulders. The pennons were chopped up by the ragged canyons and rocky spirals, and high wooded ridges a paradise for a hunted man. But Chad Hanlon was daunted. The swift succession of catastrophic events, coming in a rapid-fire order since his attempt to throw Pat Stevens off the anvil this morning, had rattled him badly. The sudden appearance of the Hardwick's men miles away from the scene of his downfall was totally unexpected. Hanlon turned his back on the thinly strung net thrown out to intercept him, and for a time he fled blindly, clawing his way deeper into the tangled wiles, as if the dreaming and reckless solitude he found there spelled sanctuary. It was a half-hour before his scattered wits warned him the only escape lay once more to the west, towards the San Pedro breaks. There was hope that he was not yet cut off in that direction by the terrifying cordon. Smashing that way on his already badly blown horse, Chad came out on the high canyon rim. Feverishly seeking a way down, he froze at the sight of a posseman working up through the scattered rocks directly below him, and his rage burst into flame. A wild shot crashed out before he flung back from the crumbling rim, and too late he realized the echoing detonation had inevitably given away his position. He pounded north, and then hauled up with a savage oath on spotting the two men that drove him towards a half-mile off, rifles across their saddle bows. Chad's handsome face went ghastly now. He flung a hunted look about. His horse was done, too far gone for any grueling race or even a few slogging miles. Where would he turn? Here, on the heights of a thick stand of pine, scraggly along the edges, extended for some distance, there was perhaps 2 or 3 square miles of heavily unkept, tangled forest growth of the kind beloved of cougars and of creeping things. Hemmed in on all sides, knowing he must finally be pinned down by the ever-closing circle, Hanlon saw in the silent woods his last refuge. Jerking his rifle from his boot, he sprang from the saddle, abandoning his heaving horse, and stumbled the last few yards across jumbled rock to plunge in amongst the trees. Riding bridle to bridle with Hardwick, Pat watched the fugitive fade amongst the long afternoon shadows that laced the pines. He understood, his two long lips folded in a stern line. "Hold the boys, Hardwick," he rasped. "Throw 'em around these woods and make sure Hanlon doesn't come out. I'm going in after him." Moving as he spoke, Pat drew his Winchester, slipped to the ground. A moment later he stepped into the heavy shadow at the lower end of the grove. Crouching, avoiding the low-hung branches. Taking advantage of the broken rocks jutted everywhere, he worked swiftly and silently towards the point where Hanlon had last been seen. 10 minutes passed. In the silence of this eerie wood was profound. Pat slipped from tree to tree, more cautiously now, studying every shade and movement. It was growing late. He would be forced to move quickly. This grim hunt had only an hour to go before gathering dusk might allow Hanlon to steal away, to lose himself in the desert night miles below. Already the red rays powdered the deep green foliage weirdly, rendering the rocks in the gullies deceptive, and the gloom was thick. A bounding jackrabbit yards off in the heavy quiet shocked Pat to an instant alertness. His rifle came up. It crashed. The slug screamed off a far rock, and Hanlon's rifle slammed almost at the same moment over there, and in the cover of thick pine Pat laughed out harshly. Chad had fired instinctively out of fright. "Hanlon, it's Stevens," he called back. "Stack has been nabbed and he's spilled the beans. Give yourself up, I'm taking you in." Chad's reply was another vicious blast, raking the rough bark of pine. He was a wild animal now, as tense and deadly as a cornered wolf. There was a fatal inevitability in the fact that Pat Stevens should be the one who was pitted against him in this stealthy duel. All his woes, every crashing disaster that had befallen him, he ascribed to this man. It was a duel to the death, and Hanlon was determined to wreak havoc of all he had suffered. Dropping the rustling needles, he crawled from the spot, circling warily for advantage of position. The ground here was gullied, rock-fanged, cluttered with fallen and dead pine trunks. It was ideal for such maneuvering. The only trouble was that Stevens could likewise be counted on the same advantage. A few minutes later, Chad received confirmation of this. He was stealing a guarded peep through jagged rocks, vainly seeking his enemy when the silence again rocked in a ringing explosion. Chad clasped his head, ducking. A tuft of hair had been snatched from above his ear, and he whirled, crawling away on his belly, a feral glare in his pupils. He began shooting wildly, firing at every shadow, and kept on the move almost aimlessly. Close as he watched, there grew a terrible feeling of a disembodied nemesis hounding him. He was creeping head first into the shallow ditch, winding through the pines, when a slug tore a ragged slash in his boot, and to his terror the gunfire seemed every time to come from a fresh quarter. Not since the first moment when Stephen's call advised his position had Chad gotten a single clean shot. He crawled into a thick snarl of scrub firs and rolled over to raise his rifle. Once more the crash of a gun shook him, and the slug struck his weapon, almost tearing it from his grasp. In a wild fury, Hanlon scrambled to his knees. He threw the gun up, and swiftly he worked the lever, whose muffled but unavoidable click had steadily given him away from the first. To his rage and astonishment, the lever came away in his hand. It had been broken by Pat's slug, and the gun was now useless. Chad turned to crash away through the brush, his breath coming in deep gasps. Bursting out in the open, he was horrified to come face to face with his foe. Stephen stood, crouched, his own rifle leveled, ready to blaze away. "Haul up, Hanlon," he hollered. "This is the end of your rope." For a crazy instant, Chad contemplated a rush which would carry him smashing into the other, tilting the scales in his favor. The very thought of failure wilted him, however, and he fell to his knees, groveling before Pat's eyes. "Don't shoot, Stevens. I give up," he rasped. "You do, huh?" Pat measured him. "Are you ready to talk, or shall I finish it here and tell Hardwick I couldn't stop you?" Chad's terror symbolized the completeness of his surrender. "What do you want me to say?" he jerked out in a groan. Pat raised his voice and called out, "Hardwick!" It It was some moments before a crashing sound came through the trees. Sam Salone, Ash Salmon, and one or two others advanced cautiously with Sheriff Hardwick at their head. They spread out to gaze at Hanlon, who gathered himself together warily. "Got him, eh?" Dane growled. Chad abruptly sprang to the lawman's side. He had lost hat and sixth gun and had tossed his worthless rifle aside. Hardwick only shoved him away. He realized Hard's demoralized state. "What's eating you?" he grated. "I demand protection, Sheriff." Chad bleated, his jaw trembling. "Stevens aims to down me." He strove to get behind Hardwick. "You downed McClellan, didn't you?" the latter hurled at him scathingly. If he had hoped to lie now, Hanlon crumbled at this. Pat walked towards him, hard-faced. "Why'd you order Stack to shoot Ike Mosher, Hanlon?" Chad blanched. "I didn't," he jerked out. "The fool was only supposed to watch. I told him." He didn't have enough courage to frame a lame alibi and stumbled to a halt. "Didn't need Stack's help to polish off Ace Kangle, did you?" Pat bore in, pressing him hard. Chad's knees sagged. Ace double-crossed me, Stevens." He blurted out the confession, pasty-faced. "I had to do it." Pat turned brusquely to Hardwick, his manner curt. "Does that satisfy you, Hardwick?" He waited for the lawman's nod. "Then take him into custody. He'll spill the whole game when you get into town. You might search him now. You'll probably find he's carrying the ranch deed that Kangle stole from my room for him." "What?" Dane whirled on Hanlon and went through his pockets. He came up with the deed and examined it in the failing light. "It's still got the transfer notification in my name on the back," Pat pointed out unemotionally. Hanlon didn't even try to remove it, he was so sure of himself. They headed out of the hills, a silent group. Chad Hanlon well guarded in the middle. Because of the exhaustion of his horse, the pace was slow, and it was nearing midnight when the cavalcade drew close to the anvil. "Well, the place is yours, Stevens," the sheriff said. "Come into town soon and we'll straighten things out." "I'll do that. Don't you worry, Sheriff." They were nearing the house when a tall shadow rose up from the dark porch steps. "Is that you, Ezra?" Pat called out sharply. "Yep." "Where's Stack?" Pat's query was tense. All waited for the answer. "Reckon he's tied to the corral bars over yonder," the lanky redhead returned coolly. Hardwick dismounted and walked over to verify the capture. They heard his growl of satisfaction on finding Stack secured into a stout upright, and Pat reached the sheriff's side. "There's your whole case, Sheriff," he declared quietly. "Stack can supply you with any information that Hanlon holds back. It'll enable you to ask that hard case bunch and cast Bella some mighty embarrassing questions, too, if you feel so inclined." "Sure is a clean sweep, Stevens," Dane conceded. "But there's Connor yet. Been cutting it pretty wild, that boy. You'll have to come in and square up some things." "He'll come in," Pat assured Hardwick confidently. "We'll leave that to Mary and McLennan." Hardwick left shortly, with Ash Salmon, to lodge his prisoners in the El Castro jail. Pat and the others turned in, too tired to eat. They were making up for it the following morning, stowing away the mountainous breakfast which Nico had prepared, when Sloane got up to peer out his window. "There's a wagon coming," announced Sam. Suddenly, his voice went flat and hard. "It's that dang Delgado back again." They got up hastily to step out onto the porch, and Sam and Ezra bristling. Each had guessed the blow which this time seemed certain to fall. It meant little to them that Nebraska Swingle was driving the spring buckboard this morning, but Pat lifted a friendly hand. "Howdy, Swingle." Nebraska's pale eyes twinkled in his leathery face. "Well, reckon you still got her horses here?" he queried gruffly.
"What of it?"
Sam fired back.
"I never seen you before."
With his lanky, one-eyed partner, he was convinced Delgado had brought this American rancher here to fight his battle more effectively. "Keep your shirt on, Shorty," Nebraska grinned. "I aim to do the talking for a spell." His news was to the effect that Sheriff Harskin of Bisbee had succeeded in recovering for Delgado the money for the horses, which the partners had turned over to Baxley at the ranch above Wilcock. Though his eyes still glittered, Don Emilio had not lost very heavily, and was no longer on the warpath. Ezra and Sam calmed down rapidly. Under Swingle's competent direction, the talk which ensued ran along more pacific lines.
"You mean you're letting us keep the horses?"
Sam demanded flatly. This appeared to be the case, on the condition, Nebraska added, that the partners consent later to buy more barb stock from Delgado at a price enabling the rancher to net a reasonable profit.
"Well, that's blackmail,"
Salone averred with a chuckle.
"But under the circumstances, I reckon we'll consent to it."
Don Emilio warmed under this ready reception of his canny proposition, and friendly relations were once more established all around by the time old Nebraska at length cramped the rig about and whirled out of the yard with his peppy companion. Sam and Ezra congratulated themselves on worming out of a tight spot more easily than they had expected, and all seemed to turn out finally for the best in every respect. But as the long day passed and merged into the second, Pat experienced considerable concern over the continued absence of Chip Connor. He had no idea of what had happened to the other, and Ezra having failed to mention seeing Connor during the capture of Stack, for all Pat knew, Chip and Marion might have fallen into a fresh disagreement, with their puncher pulling out of the country for good, in despair of ever winning the girl. The total absence of comment by Sam and the others at length forced them to a decision. On the third morning after Chad Hanlon's capture, Pat was saddling up to ride over to the H.M. with inquiries, despite his parting words with Henry McLennan, when a whoop from the house whirled him about. Sam was cutting white cappers on the porch, his pudgy body dancing. Ezra came running in long-legged strides. And then Pat saw Chip Connor and Marion riding into the yard side by side. He pushed out to meet them, his sharp eye noting their peaceful faces, in which a faint shade of guilt likewise lurked. "Well, just in time." He recovered his relief at their arrival with a casual heartiness. "I was about to get me a new foreman. Where you been keeping yourself, man?"
"I've been right busy, Stevens. Best day of work in my life," assured Chip, grinning sheepishly. "Don't ask how I persuaded Marion to marry me."
Sam whooped again.
"You mean it?"
He could really put a sincerity in his jubilant pleasure of the news, and it proved more fervent that Pat shot a suspicious look at the little fellow's face. But Chip, he was too happy to notice.
"I sure do," he affirmed. "We went to town, like Stevens wanted, and while we were waiting for news, I used the time to good advantage. Henry McLennan claims I kidnapped the best ranch manager in Arizona, but I made him admit he couldn't blame me. Even Hardwick gave me a clean bill of health. He says I'm permanently in Marion's charge now, and I better like it. I kind of reckon I do," he finished, grinning.
"Well, congratulations, Chip," Pat exclaimed warmly. "And the best to Mrs. Connor. I couldn't pick her out a better man myself," he declared, watching the happy confusion growing on Marion's face. "And to prove I mean it, Connor, I'll just name you manager of my southern ranch, beginning right now." Chip slid from the saddle to stride forward, hand extended. "Gosh, Stevens," he exclaimed, "you're saving my life. I've got nothing in the world
but the best wife a man ever stole. Reckon I figured to support her by some guess, and by gory, I was banking on you. You won't regret it, Pat. I'll be making this anvil hum."
Pat nodded, gripping his palm. "It ain't all big-heartedness," he laughed. "I need a man I can thoroughly trust, this being so far away from my base of operations over there in Powder Valley. You've been fiddle-footed a wee bit too long there, Chip. Now that you're married, it'll be a different story. I'm figuring to reap some of the benefits along with marrying."
"Oh, don't you worry." The girl's tone pretended severity, but her blue eyes were gay. "I'll see that he toes the mark, Pat."
Connor was prompt to demonstrate that he'd come a long way since winning a girl of so much spirit, shaking his head with a mock gravity.
"Oh, don't trust me too far. I'm a born crook, Stevens," he warned. "The day may not be far off when you're forced to sign the anvil over to me in self-protection."
Pat was not behind him in a ready wit. "Could be. I feel responsible for your wife myself in a way," he assured unblushingly. "If the time comes when you feel the need to ensure her security, I'll have no objection to selling the ranch as long as you agree to act as my representative when I want southern cattle." He paused, altering the direction of his talk abruptly. "I reckon you're ready for work. Right now, I mean."
"Sure. We got hitched in the Bonanza Belt and come up the valley to Telecaster yesterday," Chip informed him. "We were pushing on to the HM this morning."
Pat's quizzical smile was shrewd. "Henry McLennan wasn't so easy to face, huh?"
"Well, I made him yell uncle and like it," Connor said stoutly. "Didn't do him no good. He's got to replace Marion as well as Ike Mosher. My wife's place from here on out is with me, and that's where he'll find her."
"Ain't a thing to keep you from staying, then, is it?"
"Not a thing."
Chip was puzzled.
"Why?"
"Not much." Pat started to turn away. "It was just that I was figuring to leave you here to yourselves on the anvil for a long honeymoon. Now that Sam and Ezra are ready to head north to their horses, I'll be packing up and getting along." End of chapter 18. End of Three Guns from Colorado. Thank you for coming along this fine journey. We have many more audiobooks on this channel. Take a look through our playlists. I'm sure you'll find something to entertain your little ears. Anyways, it's been a pleasure. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye for now.